She stepped off that dusty stagecoach with 2 swaddled babies in her arms, hope in her eyes, dust on her cheeks. She had crossed half a continent for a man who'd promised her a future. But when he saw the children, his smile faded, and he walked away without a word. Folks in town shook their heads, thinking her story was over. They didn't know a lonely doctor, with his own silent grief, was about to change everything, and face down the kind of men who'd see them all destroyed. The wind moved slow and warm through the single street of Hollow Creek, carrying with it the mingled scents of horse sweat, pine resin, and dust. Sunlight blazed down from a sky so bright it turned every shadow sharp as a knife. Storefronts with peeling paint lined the road, their porches crowded with men leaning on railings, waiting for the midday stage. The sound of its wheels, wood and iron grinding over hard earth, reached them before the coach itself came into view, a dull rhythm that set the air humming. When it finally rounded the bend, horses lathered and breathing hard, a murmur ran through the onlookers. News had traveled quick that Jed Mallory's bride was coming in from Missouri. In a town where nothing much changed, a mail-order bride was something to talk about for weeks. Heads craned, eyes narrowed, every man and woman curious to see what kind of woman had agreed to tie her life to Jed, of all people. The coach shuddered to a halt, and the driver swung down with a grunt, opening the door. The first glimpse of her was a small boot, scuffed from travel, then the hem of a plain, travel-worn dress. Clara Whitford stepped down slowly, clutching a sleeping infant to her chest, while another rested in a sling across her front. Her dark hair was pinned neatly, though the wind had loosened strands that framed her face. Her eyes scanned the crowd with quiet hope, searching for one man. Jed Mallory stepped forward from the shade of the saloon awning. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that looked better when it wasn't smiling. For a moment his expression did soften. Then his gaze dropped to the bundles in her arms. His jaw tightened. "You didn't say you had children." His voice was flat, carrying just enough to be heard by the closest onlookers. Clara's lips parted, ready to explain, but Jed took a step back. "I can't do this," he said, voice low but sharp enough to cut. "I ain't signing up to raise another man's young uns." She stood frozen, the heat pressing down on her, the weight of her journey suddenly unbearable. A ripple went through the crowd, soft gasps, low whispers. Someone muttered, "Lord help her." Jed turned without another word and strode back toward the saloon, vanishing into its dark interior as if she had never arrived. For a long moment, no one moved. Clara's face flushed with humiliation, but her grip on the babies didn't falter. She took a slow breath, straightened her spine, and looked around as though measuring how far she'd have to walk before her legs gave out. That was when Dr. Elijah Cole stepped from the boardwalk in front of his small clinic. He was a tall man, though not imposing, his frame lean from long days' work, his hair touched with early gray at the temples. A pair of wire-rimmed spectacles caught the sunlight, but his eyes, steady and dark, were the first thing people noticed about him. He approached without hurry, his boots quiet in the dust, until he stood before her. "Ma'am," he said gently, tipping his hat, "you look like you've been on the road a while. My place is just there." He nodded toward the small building with a faded shingle swinging in the wind. "It's cooler inside. You and the little ones could use some shade and a drink of water." Clara hesitated, her pride stiff against the offer, but the baby at her chest stirred and whimpered. She glanced once toward the saloon door where Jed had vanished, then back at Elijah. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she admitted. Then it settled. He offered an arm to guide her across the street, but she shook her head, keeping both hands on the babies. He didn't press, simply walked beside her. The crowd parted without a word, though she could feel their eyes on her, heavy as the sun. Inside the clinic, the air was cooler, the smell of clean linen and medicinal herbs replacing the dust and sweat outside. Elijah pulled a chair forward. "Sit. I'll fetch water." She lowered herself carefully, the twins still sleeping. Her gaze drifted over the room, shelves lined with jars, the tidy cot in the corner, a desk littered with notes. She saw no signs of another family here. When Elijah returned with a tin cup, she took it in one hand, drinking deeply before speaking. I'm Clara Whitford. Came from Springfield. Jed and I corresponded for months." Her voice faltered. He knew I'd been married before. "I didn't think the children would." She stopped, shaking her head. Elijah studied her quietly, his hands resting in his pockets. "Men sometimes think themselves braver than they are," he said at last. The babies shifted, and Clara began rocking them gently. "I don't want charity, doctor." "Didn't offer any," he said, a faint smile at the corner of his mouth. "I could use someone to help keep this place in order. My assistant moved away last month. You work for your keep. You'll earn it." She looked at him, seeing something in his eyes. Kindness, yes, but also a weight, like a man who carried something he didn't speak about. Slowly, she nodded. "All right." That afternoon passed in a blur. Clara settled the twins in a small room Elijah rarely used. She washed her face, changed into a clean dress from her satchel, and began putting things in order in the clinic. He watched her from the doorway once, quietly impressed by how quickly she moved despite the children. As evening settled, a hush fell over Hollow Creek. The horizon burned with the last of the sun, turning the desert into a sea of copper and gold. From the clinic window, Elijah saw movement, a lone rider on the far ridge, silhouetted against the sky. The figure sat motionless, watching the town. His hand tightened on the windowsill. Something in the rider's stillness didn't sit right. He had seen men wait like that before, years ago, when waiting meant planning. Clara stepped into the room behind him, holding one of the babies against her shoulder. "Something wrong." He forced a neutral tone. "Just a traveler, maybe. Still a long way off." But when he looked back, the rider was gone, swallowed by the desert shadows, and a familiar unease had begun to coil in his chest. The days slipped into a quiet rhythm, the kind that made Hollow Creek seem almost untouched by the chaos that roamed the rest of the frontier. Clara rose early each morning, tending to the twins before sweeping through the clinic, setting instruments in order, boiling water for the day's patients. Elijah moved about with his steady, unhurried gait, mending cuts, easing fevers, and splinting the occasional broken limb. She worked beside him without complaint, and though they spoke little at first, a quiet understanding began to take root between them. By the second week, she noticed how often he lingered near the cradle, his large hands surprisingly sure when he held one of the babies. He had a way of rocking them just enough to lull them back to sleep, his deep voice humming a low, tuneless melody. When she remarked on it, he only shrugged, as if such tenderness needed no explanation. One evening, as the last patient left and the smell of laudanum still hung in the air, Elijah remained by the window, staring into the deepening dusk. Clara was folding clean bandages when she asked, almost without thinking, "You've children of your own?" He didn't answer right away. His jaw worked slightly before he spoke. "Had a daughter. Rose. She was 6. His gaze stayed on the horizon. "My wife, too. Fever took them both, 3 winters back. By the time I could do anything." His voice thinned and he stopped, as if the rest of the sentence had no air to carry it. Clara lowered her eyes, the weight of his loss settling heavy between them. "I'm sorry," she said softly. He nodded once, almost briskly, as though gratitude was harder to bear than grief. "We keep moving forward. That's all there is." She understood more than she wished. She had not told him the whole of her own story, only that her first husband had been a railroad worker, killed in an accident, leaving her with debts and no means to feed 2 newborns. The truth was harsher. He'd gambled away what little they had, drunk himself into rages, and when he was gone, she'd been glad to be free, even if freedom meant scraping by in boarding houses and washing other people's clothes. Jed's letter, full of polite words and promises of stability, had felt like a lifeline. She'd answered because she wanted her children to grow up somewhere safe, where people might know their names. Word of trouble came to Hollow Creek in fragments, carried on the dusty tongues of drifters and ranch hands. The Barrow Gang, 5 men and a woman, had been seen near Miller's Crossing, holding up a freight wagon and leaving 2 men dead. They were said to ride under a black-stitched flag and take what they pleased, quick to draw and quicker to kill. Folks in town muttered their names over coffee at the cafe, glancing toward the door as if the gang might walk through at any moment. Late one afternoon, Clara stepped onto the clinic's porch to shake out a blanket and froze. Across the wide stretch of sunlit street, beyond the scattered buildings, on a rise where the land dipped toward the dry creek bed, a lone rider sat his horse. The same dark silhouette she'd seen that first day, unmoving, watching. A shiver climbed her spine despite the heat. "Elijah," she called quietly. He joined her on the porch, squinting into the glare. By the time his eyes found the ridge, the figure was gone. "You're sure it was someone?" he asked. She nodded. "I know what I saw." His expression darkened. "Best keep the doors locked come night." The warning came formal a few days later when the sheriff called a town meeting in the church hall. The benches filled with ranchers, shopkeepers, and freighters, all wearing the same tight, uneasy look. Sheriff Grady, a stout man with a thinning mustache, stood at the front. "Barrow Gang's been making their way up from the south," he said, voice cutting through the murmurs. "They've hit 2 towns in the past month. Took cash, stock, and left blood behind. If you see riders you don't know, stay indoors. Don't be a hero, let us deal with it." Clara felt the twins squirm in her lap, restless under the hum of voices. She tried to listen, but when Grady listed the gang by name, one caught in her chest like a thorn. Cole Barrow. She'd heard that name once before, spoken in the dark corner of a saloon back in Missouri. She remembered his laughter, low and mean, the way he'd looked at her. It was no accident she'd left that town in the dead of night, boarding the first train west. Her hands tightened on the babies until one whimpered. She glanced toward Elijah, but he was watching the sheriff, his profile stern and unreadable. She said nothing. Not yet. As the meeting broke apart, Elijah stayed behind to speak with Grady. Clara stepped outside into the cooling air, letting the twins rest their heads against her shoulders. The main street was quieter than usual, the gold light of sunset making the town look almost peaceful. But her eyes kept flicking to the edges, the alleys, the rooftops, the far ridge, where the horizon bled into shadow. That night, she found Elijah sitting at the small table in the clinic, a ledger open but unread before him. One of the babies stirred in the cradle, fussing softly. He rose without a word, scooping the child into his arms with practiced ease. Clara watched as he paced the floor, murmuring something too low to hear. The child settled almost instantly, small fists uncurling against his shirt. "You're good with them," she said quietly. He glanced over his shoulder. "Not good. Careful." A faint smile touched his mouth, then faded. "They deserve careful." Something in her chest loosened at that. For weeks she'd been braced for pity, for judgment, for some reminder that she was a burden. Instead she saw a man who, for reasons she didn't yet understand, had chosen to stand beside her without asking what it might cost him. The next morning broke hot and cloudless, the air sharp with the smell of dust before a storm. Clara had just finished hanging a line of laundry behind the clinic when a shout went up from the far end of town. She turned, shielding her eyes. 5 riders were coming in slow from the south, their horses dark with sweat, their coats and hats streaked with trail dust. Even from a distance, she could see the way they sat their saddles, loose, predatory, as if the street already belonged to them. One of them carried a black-stitched flag, slung over his shoulder. Her breath caught. She knew those faces. The Barrow Gang had come to Hollow Creek. The Barrow Gang rode in like they owned the dust beneath their horses' hooves. 5 of them, spread wide across the main street, their mounts kicking up a yellow haze that drifted over porches and open doors. The townsfolk who'd been tending errands melted away, slipping inside shops and shuttering windows. Only the sound of creaking leather, the jangle of spurs, and the slow, unhurried clop of hooves filled the heat-heavy air. Cole Barrow rode at the center, a tall, raw-boned man with a hawk's beak for a nose and eyes pale enough to look like chips of winter ice. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his grin, the kind of grin that never held kindness. A black-stitched flag hung from his saddle, snapping lazily in the breeze like a warning. When his gaze swept the street and found Clara standing stiff on the clinic's porch, it was as if the rest of the town ceased to exist. "Well now," he drawled, reining his horse to a halt before her. "Ain't this something? Thought I'd lost you, Clara girl." She didn't move. though her fingers tightened on the railing. "You didn't lose me, Cole. I left." His grin widened, showing teeth. "Without saying goodbye? That's cold. After all the fine talk I gave you. The doors I was ready to open." His eyes flicked to the cradle inside the doorway, where the twins lay sleeping. "And you've been busy, too." Her stomach turned, but she kept her voice steady. "You stay away from me." "Oh, now, that don't sound neighborly. You remember what I told you back in Independence? That once you ride with me, you're mine." He leaned forward in the saddle, lowering his voice just enough for her to hear. "And you never paid what you owed." The scrape of boots came from down the street as Sheriff Grady and his 2 deputies emerged from behind the livery. "That's enough, Barrow," the sheriff called, hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "You and your boys turn those horses south, and keep riding." Cole didn't even glance his way. "Grady, I think you know how this works. You've got 3 guns, I've got 5. Do the math." The deputies shifted uneasily, sweat shining at their temples. The gang behind Cole lounged in their saddles, hands close to their pistols, eyes tracking every movement. From the doorway of the clinic, Elijah stepped into the sunlight. He didn't hurry, didn't raise his voice, just walked forward until he stood between Clara and Cole. "You've had your say," he told Cole. "Now ride out." For a moment, there was silence. Then the gang laughed, low, ugly laughter. Cole shook his head in mock disbelief. "A doctor," he said, standing up like he's gonna patch me to death. "You know who you're talking to, old man." Elijah's tone didn't change. "I know enough. You're not taking her." Clara's hand caught his sleeve. "Don't," she whispered, her voice raw with fear. "You don't know what he's capable of." But Elijah didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on Cole's, steady as stone. Something unspoken passed between them, something Cole didn't like. The outlaw's grin faltered just a fraction. Long before Hollow Creek, before the quiet rhythm of mending bones and brewing tonics, Elijah Cole had been another man entirely. The years had buried him in dust and silence, but in moments like this, the past stirred. He saw flashes, winter fields under a gray sky, the sharp crack of rifle fire, the way a man could be here one moment and gone the next. In the war, they called him Deadeye Eli, a name whispered with respect and wariness. He'd been good, too good, and when the war ended, he'd put the rifle away, swearing he'd never raise it again. But war had a way of finding a man, even years later, even in a town small enough to fit in the palm of your hand. Elijah turned to Clara, just enough for her to see the resolve in his face. "Go inside," he said quietly. "No. Now." Her throat tightened, but she obeyed, retreating into the clinic where the twins stirred in their cradle. She closed the door, though the heat and tension still seeped through the wood. Elijah's eyes went to the porch, to the narrow gap beside the door where a long, dust-stained rifle leaned unnoticed by most visitors. He had kept it there for years, telling himself it was only for wolves or the rare rabid coyote. His hand closed around the stock with a familiarity that made the years vanish. Cole's gaze followed the movement. "Well, well," he said softly. "Maybe the doc's got some teeth after all." The street seemed to hold its breath. The sheriff's hand hovered over his gun. The gang's laughter died, replaced by the creak of leather and the quiet sound of knuckles flexing. Elijah stepped down from the porch, rifle balanced easy in his grip. "You've got one chance to leave," he said. "You don't take it, you won't get another." Cole studied him for a long moment, the pale of his eyes narrowing. Then he smiled again, but there was no warmth in it now. "Guess we'll see if the good doctor's still got his aim." Somewhere, a shutter banged in the wind. The sun burned down on the street, and the distance between them felt like the length of a trigger pull. Elijah's heartbeat slowed, each sound around him sharpening. The whisper of the wind through the eaves, the soft rustle of fabric as someone inside the cafe shifted, the faint squeak of a saddle stirrup. It was the same as it had been years ago, the same stillness before the first shot, the same knowledge that when the air moved again, nothing would be the same. The street lay in a silence so deep it felt carved from stone. Heat shimmered off the hard-packed earth, the sun hanging high and merciless, casting short shadows beneath the men who faced each other. Elijah stood in the open, the rifle resting against his shoulder, his frame still but coiled. Across from him, the Barrow Gang waited, hands brushing the grips of their revolvers, eyes glinting with the restless urge to end this. Cole Barrow smiled like a man who thought he already knew the ending. Last chance, document step aside, and maybe I'll leave you breathing that. Elijah's answer came in the sharp report of his rifle. The sound cracked through the air, echoing between the false-fronted buildings. A puff of dust jumped from the dirt beside one outlaw's boot, close enough to make him flinch and stumble back. The second shot came before the first man caught his breath, shattering the wooden handle of another's revolver, sending the weapon spinning into the dust. The gang shifted, unnerved. Elijah's aim was surgical, each shot meant to disarm, to send a message without spilling blood too soon. The quiet confidence in the way he moved unsettled them more than any wild gunfire would have. Cole's grin thinned. You always were a coward, Eli. Still hiding behind that holier-than-thou talk. He swung his leg over his saddle and dropped to the ground, walking forward with a predator's lope. Maybe I'll take something you can't shoot out of my hand. He lunged toward the clinic door. The hinges screamed as he yanked it open, and in an instant he had Clara by the arm, dragging her into the blinding sunlight. The twins began to wail from inside, their cries carrying through the heat. Cole's revolver pressed under her chin as he used her body for cover. Drop it, Doc, he called, his voice oily with triumph. Or I'll put her down right here. Elijah's stance didn't change, though his gaze locked on Clara. She was breathing fast, eyes wide, but he saw something else there, resolve. She shifted just enough to give him a sliver of space, no more than the width of a coin. Cole saw the flicker of movement in Elijah's eyes and tightened his grip on her, laughing. You ain't got it in you anymore. The rifle's barrel dipped a fraction, almost imperceptible. Cole's grin deepened, then the shot came. The sound was deafening in the still air, and for an instant, it seemed nothing had changed. Then Cole's revolver dropped from his hand, his fingers limp from the bullet that had torn through his wrist. Clara wrenched free, stumbling toward the porch. Cole's eyes blazed with rage as he clutched his ruined hand, and with his left he reached for another weapon at his hip. Elijah didn't hesitate this time. The next shot struck true, center of the chest. Cole staggered back, eyes wide in disbelief, before crumpling into the dust. The gang froze. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then one man swore under his breath and swung into his saddle. Another followed, and in moments they were wheeling their horses, riding hard for the southern road. The sheriff and his deputies, emboldened now, stepped into the street, weapons ready, but the danger was already retreating in a cloud of dust. Elijah lowered the rifle, the weight of it pulling at his arms in a way it hadn't years ago. His breathing was steady, but his eyes carried the quiet knowledge of what it meant to take a life, even a man like Cole Barrow. Clara stood at the edge of the porch, one hand clutching the doorframe, the other pressed to her racing heart. She looked at Cole's still form, then at Elijah, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words coming at first. When she found her voice, it was soft. You saved us. He shook his head slightly. You saved yourself. I just made sure it stuck. The sheriff crossed to them, clapping Elijah on the shoulder with the rough gratitude of a man who knew he'd been outmatched, without help. Didn't know you had that in you, he said. Neither did I, Elijah replied, though they both knew it wasn't true. From the far side of the street, Jed Mallory had emerged, drawn by the gunfire. He stood stiff in the shade of the saloon, his face pale under the brim of his hat. When his eyes met Clara's, he looked away quickly, turning back inside without a word. The rest of the townsfolk began to gather, drifting cautiously from doorways and alleys. They looked at Clara differently now, not with pity, but with the kind of respect born from seeing someone endure and survive. A woman who could face down the likes of Cole Barrow and still stand was not to be dismissed. Elijah handed the rifle back into its place by the clinic door as if it had never been touched. Clara followed him inside, where the twins had quieted to soft hiccups. She moved to them immediately, checking their tiny faces, her hands trembling just a little. He watched her for a moment, then spoke. They'll talk about today for a while, but soon enough, things will go back to quiet. Clara smiled faintly. Quiet sounds good. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of what they'd just been through, and of the strange, fragile thread now tying their futures together. Outside, the dust was settling, the last echoes of gunfire fading into the desert air. Somewhere beyond the ridges, the Barrow Gang was nursing its wounds and counting its losses, but Hollow Creek was safe, for now. And so they say, years later, when the story makes its rounds in saloons and by campfires, that sometimes the bravest guns in the West were carried by men who swore they'd never use them again.